Chosen one, something unusual is happening around your name right now, and the shift is so dramatic that even the people who once controlled the narrative are struggling to keep up with it. For a long time, different stories were told about you. Some people repeated one version of events while others quietly spread another. Each story seemed to change depending on who was speaking, where the conversation was happening, and what reaction they hoped to provoke from the audience listening. At first, those contradictions remained hidden beneath the surface because most people rarely pause long enough to compare different accounts of the same situation. But over time, something inevitable began happening. The more stories were told, the harder it became to keep them consistent. Gradually, observers started noticing that the explanations did not match. Details shifted. Timelines changed. Motives were described differently depending on the speaker. What was once presented as certainty slowly began revealing itself as a web of narratives that could not fully hold together. And when people begin seeing those inconsistencies clearly, the focus naturally shifts away from the person being talked about and toward the people who created the stories in the first place. This moment of exposure is powerful because it does not happen through loud confrontation, but through simple awareness. As individuals begin comparing what they have heard from different sources, the truth quietly starts rising above the noise. At the same time, another surprising development begins unfolding behind the scenes. Your mindset, the calm and clarity you have demonstrated throughout the entire process, has drawn attention from circles far beyond the immediate environment where those rumors began. People who operate at high levels of influence and wealth have noticed something unusual about the way you move through pressure and misunderstanding. Instead of reacting emotionally or trying to defend yourself at every moment, you remained composed, patient, and focused on your direction. That kind of mental discipline is rare. And when something rare appears in environments where human behavior is often studied like a system, curiosity quickly follows. In fact, curiosity has grown so strong that someone with immense resources has taken an extraordinary step. They hired a psychologist to study how your mind works. What began as a series of conflicting stories meant to shape public perception has now turned into a deeper investigation into the power of your thinking. The irony is impossible to ignore. The same rumors that were meant to weaken your reputation have ultimately drawn attention to the strength behind your mindset. And as the truth begins surfacing, while your mental clarity continues attracting serious analysis, the entire situation reveals something important about the path you have been walking all along. The moment their stories started falling apart did not arrive through one dramatic exposure or a single voice confronting the rumors directly, but through a slow unraveling that began the moment people started paying closer attention to the details. For a long time, the narratives told about you moved through conversations almost like background noise. One person would repeat something they had heard from someone else, and that version would travel forward without being questioned too deeply. Another person would add a slightly different interpretation, sometimes adjusting the timeline, sometimes changing the motives, sometimes exaggerating the emotional intensity of what supposedly happened. At first, these variations did not raise alarms, because most people tend to assume that repeated information must contain at least some element of truth. The human mind is naturally inclined to trust familiarity. When a story is heard multiple times, it begins to feel credible simply because it appears to be shared knowledge. Yet the weakness of that kind of narrative lies in its structure. Stories that are built on speculation rather than reality often require constant adjustments to remain believable. Every time a new audience hears the storyteller may add or remove details to make it more convincing. Over time, those adjustments create subtle contradictions that only become visible once people begin comparing the versions carefully. This is exactly the moment when the shift around your name quietly began. Someone heard one version of the story and later heard another version that did not quite match. At first, they may have dismissed the difference as a misunderstanding. But then another conversation happened, and the details shifted again. The tone changed. The explanation of why something supposedly occurred became slightly different. Gradually, these small inconsistencies accumulated like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. People began noticing that the story about you seemed to change depending on who was telling it. In one version, you were described as the instigator of conflict. In another version, you were portrayed as distant or uncooperative. In yet another, the narrative implied that you were somehow manipulating events from behind the scenes. Yet when people placed those versions side by side, something felt wrong. The motives did not align. The timelines overlapped in ways that made little sense. Some individuals began realizing that they had never actually witnessed the events being described firsthand. Their entire understanding of the situation came from hearing someone else explain it. Once that realization enters a conversation, the dynamic begins shifting almost immediately. Instead of repeating the narrative automatically, listeners start asking quiet questions. Who first said this? When exactly did it happen? Why do different people describe it differently? These questions do not require confrontation to create impact. Their power lies in the way they interrupt the automatic flow of repetition that rumors depend upon. The moment someone pauses to examine a story, rather than simply passing it forward, the story loses much of its momentum. That pause began spreading through the environment around you. Conversations that once felt certain started becoming cautious. People who had confidently repeated certain claims suddenly realized they could not explain the details when asked directly. The more questions appeared, the more obvious the contradictions became. In some cases, two individuals who had both repeated the same rumor discovered that they had heard completely different explanations about how the situation began. That realization produced a quiet sense of discomfort. Because once someone recognizes that a story cannot maintain consistency, they begin reconsidering everything connected to it. At this stage, the attention of the community slowly shifts away from you and toward the storytellers themselves. The focus moves from the person who was discussed to the reliability of the people doing the talking. Observers start noticing patterns they previously overlooked. They remember that certain individuals always seemed eager to explain your behavior in the most negative light. They begin recalling moments where those same individuals struggled to keep their explanations aligned with the facts when someone asked follow-up questions. Gradually, the narrative begins turning back on its creators. The people who once appeared confident in their accusations now appear uncertain when asked to clarify their statements. The audience that once accepted the stories without hesitation now listens more carefully. Some even begin comparing notes privately, discussing the different versions they have heard. And as those comparisons continue, the inconsistencies become impossible to ignore. The collapse of the narrative does not happen with loud confrontation, but with quiet recognition. Listeners begin realizing that the same story cannot simultaneously contain so many conflicting details and still remain reliable. The more they reflect on it, the more they understand that the contradictions reveal something important. The stories were never stable because they were never grounded in a consistent truth. They were shaped by interpretation, emotion, and sometimes by personal agendas that changed depending on the situation. Meanwhile, your response to all of this remained remarkably steady. Instead of engaging in endless arguments to correct every version of the rumor, you continued moving forward with the same clarity that guided you from the beginning. That decision, which may have seemed quiet or even passive to some observers, at first now begins revealing its deeper strength. By refusing to chase every rumor with reaction, you allowed time and awareness to do what emotional confrontation rarely accomplishes. You allowed the contradictions to reveal themselves naturally. This approach creates a powerful psychological effect within the community. When someone constantly defends themselves against accusations, the conflict can sometimes appear like two sides arguing over competing interpretations. But when one side remains calm while the other repeatedly changes its story, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. People begin recognizing the difference between reaction and stability. They notice that while the narratives about you shifted constantly, your behavior remained consistent. Consistency is one of the most powerful indicators of truth because it cannot easily be maintained through fabrication. Someone inventing a story often struggles to keep the details aligned over time, but someone simply living according to their principles does not need to adjust their explanation repeatedly. Their actions speak for themselves through the pattern they create. As more people observe that pattern in your life, the earlier rumors begin losing their influence. The community starts understanding that the most reliable evidence of someone's character is not the stories told about them, but the way they behave consistently over time. The storytellers, on the other hand, now find themselves under a different kind of scrutiny. Individuals who once listened quietly begin asking questions about their credibility. If the stories about you contained so many contradictions, what else might have been exaggerated or misunderstood? This realization marks the true turning point in the situation. The moment their stories began falling apart was the moment people realized that truth does not need constant adjustment to remain believable. And as the contradictions continue surfacing in conversation after conversation, the narrative that once seemed powerful gradually dissolves under the weight of its own inconsistency. Why your calm response confused? Everyone begins revealing itself the moment people compare your behavior to what they expected someone in your position would normally do. In most situations where rumors spread and reputations become the subject of conflicting narratives, the reaction tends to follow a predictable pattern. The person at the center of the storm usually responds quickly, sometimes emotionally, sometimes defensively, trying to correct every accusation or clarify every misunderstanding before it spreads any further. This instinct is understandable because human beings naturally want to protect their reputation and restore a sense of fairness when they feel misrepresented. In environments where communication moves quickly and opinions travel from one conversation to another, reacting immediately often feels like the only way to prevent the situation from growing larger. Yet the moment people began observing your response, something unexpected appeared. Instead of reacting with urgency, you remained composed. Instead of chasing every rumor to explain your side, you continued focusing on your point. At first, this reaction puzzled many observers because it did not align with the usual emotional rhythm of public conflict. Some individuals even misinterpreted your calmness in the beginning. They assumed silence meant indifference or that your lack of confrontation meant the rumors might contain some truth. These assumptions often arise when people rely on familiar behavioral cues to interpret situations. If someone is innocent, they expect immediate defense. If someone is accused unfairly, they expect visible frustration. But your response followed a different pattern entirely. Rather than entering the noise, you allowed the noise to reveal itself. Rather than reacting emotionally, you maintained clarity about what truly mattered in the long run. At first, this approach appeared unusual, but as time passed, the psychological effect of your calmness began influencing the environment around you. Because when one person refuses to escalate conflict, the attention of observers gradually shifts toward the behavior of the people who continue escalating it. Your composure created a contrast that many individuals did not immediately recognize but slowly began noticing. In conversations where others repeated accusations with intensity, your steady presence became a silent comparison. People began realizing that the emotional energy surrounding the rumors did not come from you. It came from the individuals spreading them. This distinction may seem subtle, but it carries enormous psychological weight. Human beings often trust emotional signals as indicators of sincerity. When someone appears angry or passionate, listeners sometimes assume their emotions reflect genuine conviction. Yet when those emotions appear repeatedly, without consistent evidence, they begin losing their persuasive power. Your calm response interrupted the emotional momentum that rumors often depend upon to survive, because rumors thrive on reaction. They grow stronger when the person being discussed responds with equal intensity, creating a cycle where both sides appear locked in conflict. But when one side refuses to participate in that cycle, the narrative begins losing its dramatic tension. Observers become curious about why someone would remain calm under such pressure. That curiosity often leads to deeper reflection. People begin asking themselves whether the accusations truly deserve the emotional intensity surrounding them. They start looking more closely at the details of what was said. And once they begin examining those details, the inconsistencies described earlier start becoming more visible. The more time passed, the clearer this contrast became. While the stories about you continued shifting from one version to another, your behavior remained remarkably stable. You did not rush to defend your image in every conversation. You did not try to control how every person interpreted the situation. Instead, you continued living according to the same principles that guided you before the rumors began. For many observers, this stability gradually became more convincing than any argument you could have presented. Because consistency over time communicates something powerful about a person's character. Words can be manipulated, but patterns of behavior reveal deeper truths. As people watched you continue moving forward without losing your focus, they began noticing something important. The accusations being repeated about you did not seem to affect the way you treated others or the way you approached your responsibilities. You remained thoughtful in your interactions. You continued supporting the people around you. You maintained the same discipline in your work and the same clarity in your decisions. This consistency created a silent testimony that began speaking louder than the rumors themselves. The people observing you slowly realized that if the stories being told were accurate, your behavior would likely reflect some trace of the qualities described in those accusations. But instead, they saw the opposite. They saw someone who remained grounded even when facing misunderstanding. Someone who refused to allow external noise to alter their internal direction. Someone who understood that reacting to every rumor would only strengthen the narrative rather than dissolve it. This realization produced a surprising shift in the community's perception. What initially appeared as silence began appearing as wisdom. Your decision to remain calm under pressure demonstrated a level of emotional discipline that many people rarely witness firsthand. Emotional discipline does not mean ignoring injustice or pretending that rumors have no impact. It means recognizing that not every battle deserves immediate confrontation. Sometimes the most effective response is allowing truth to reveal itself through time and consistency rather than through argument. As observers began recognizing this principle in your behavior, your calmness stopped appearing mysterious and started appearing intentional. People realized that your composure was not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of inner confidence. You understood that your character would eventually speak for itself if you continued living according to your values. And that understanding changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Instead of appearing like someone trapped in a defensive position, you began appearing like someone who understood the long-term power of patience. Patience is often underestimated in environments where quick reactions dominate communication. But patience allows time to expose contradictions that would otherwise remain hidden. Every day you remained steady while the rumors continued evolving gave observers another opportunity to compare the narratives being told with the reality they could see directly. Eventually, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The calmness that once confused everyone became the very reason people started questioning the stories more seriously. Because the longer someone demonstrates stability under pressure, the harder it becomes to believe that instability defines their character. And so the same response that initially puzzled observers gradually became the key factor that helped them see the situation more clearly. Your calm presence did not silence the rumors through force. Instead, it created the space necessary for truth to emerge on its own. The unexpected. Attention from powerful circles begins unfolding quietly once the contradictions in the rumors surrounding you start becoming visible to more and more people, because whenever a situation reveals something unusual about human behavior, it eventually attracts attention from individuals who are trained to study such patterns carefully. At first, the conversations about you remained limited to the immediate environment where those conflicting stories had been circulating. People compared what they had heard, questioned the reliability of certain narratives, and slowly began recognizing that the situation was far more complicated than it first appeared. Yet as the contrast between your calm behavior and the shifting accusations grew more obvious, something else started happening behind the scenes. Individuals outside the immediate circle, where the rumors began, started hearing about the situation as well. In many environments where influence and strategy play important roles, people naturally pay attention to situations that reveal unusual psychological dynamics. When someone maintains composure under pressure, while others struggle to keep their narratives consistent, it signals a pattern worth observing. The attention from these more distant observers did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It arrived through quiet curiosity. Someone who had heard fragments of the story might begin asking questions about the person who remained calm while others appeared increasingly defensive. Another individual might notice that despite the rumors, your behavior continued reflecting discipline and stability. Over time, those small observations travel further than anyone initially expects. People who operate in circles where human behavior is constantly analyzed often develop a habit of watching carefully when something seems psychologically unusual. And in your case, the situation contained several elements that naturally attracted that kind of attention. First, there was the contrast between the accusations and your response. In environments where reputation conflicts normally escalate quickly, your refusal to engage emotionally created an unusual pattern. Second, there was the growing inconsistency in the stories told about you. Individuals trained to recognize manipulation quickly notice when narratives shift depending on who is speaking. And third, there was the quiet persistence with which you continued moving forward despite the noise surrounding your name. These three factors together formed a psychological puzzle that eventually reached the ears of people who spend much of their time studying influence decision-making and human behavior. Among those individuals was someone whose life operates on a very different scale from the environment where the rumors originally began. This person is accustomed to analyzing people carefully because their world depends heavily on understanding motivation. Wealth, power, and strategic influence create environments where predicting human behavior becomes essential for making decisions that affect enormous resources. Over the years, individuals in such positions often develop an instinct for recognizing patterns in how people react to pressure, opportunity, and conflict. They learn to read subtle signals that reveal what someone truly values or fears. When they first heard about the situation surrounding you, their interest was not necessarily emotional. It was analytical. They wanted to understand why the dynamics unfolding around your name seemed so unusual. On the surface, the story sounded like many others they had encountered before. Conflicting narratives, accusations, shifting explanations, and a central figure being discussed by multiple voices. Yet one element made the situation stand out immediately. The central figure in the story, you, was not behaving according to the pattern normally associated with such situations. Instead of reacting with urgency, you appeared almost unaffected by the emotional turbulence surrounding you. This reaction alone was enough to trigger curiosity from someone used to analyzing psychological responses in complex environments. Because when people face threats to their reputation or identity, they typically reveal strong emotional signals. Those signals provide clues about their motivations, insecurities, and strategic thinking. But your calmness disrupted that usual process of interpretation. Observers who were accustomed to decoding behavior through reaction suddenly found themselves with very little reaction to decode. That absence of predictable signals made the situation far more intriguing than the rumors themselves. As the attention of this powerful observer grew, they began asking questions about you that extended beyond the rumors. They wanted to know how you normally handled pressure. They wanted to understand how you made decisions when faced with conflicting opinions. They were curious about the experiences that shaped your mindset long before the situation involving those rumors ever began. The answers they received revealed something interesting. People who had interacted with you over longer periods described the same qualities that had become visible during the recent conflict. They spoke about your patience during difficult moments. They mentioned your tendency to observe carefully before responding to complex situations. They noted that your decisions often appeared guided by long-term perspective rather than immediate emotional impulses. These descriptions created an image of a mindset that did not align easily with the typical behavioral models used to interpret human reactions. The powerful observer listening to these accounts began realizing that the rumors about you might actually be the least interesting part of the story. What fascinated them was the psychology behind your composure. In environments where influence is often built through emotional leverage, encountering someone who maintains independence from those emotional triggers raises important questions. The observer started wondering whether your mindset represented something deeper than simple personality traits. They suspected that the calmness people described might originate from a disciplined way of thinking that developed through experience rather than through natural temperament alone. This curiosity gradually transformed into a decision. Instead of relying on second-hand descriptions or personal speculation, they chose to involve someone trained to analyze psychological patterns professionally. That decision marked the moment when attention from powerful circles moved from curiosity into deliberate investigation. A psychologist was brought in to study the situation more closely, not because you had done anything dramatic or controversial, but because your response to the situation revealed something rare. A person whose thinking appeared resistant to the usual emotional triggers that shape most human behavior. What made the decision even more interesting was the motivation behind it. The observer did not hire the psychologist out of hostility or suspicion. They did it because they genuinely wanted to understand how a mindset like yours forms. They recognized that individuals who operate with such clarity under pressure often possess insights about resilience and decision-making that cannot be easily taught through theory alone. And so the situation that began with rumors and contradictions quietly evolved into something entirely different. The attention once focused on the stories told about you gradually shifted toward the psychology behind your response to those stories. Powerful observers began realizing that the real question was not whether the accusations were true or false. The real question was how someone could remain so steady while the environment around them became increasingly chaotic. That question would soon lead to an investigation that revealed far more about your mindset than anyone initially expected. The psychological investigation that revealed more than expected begins the moment the observer who had been quietly studying the unusual dynamics surrounding your situation decided that speculation was no longer enough because curiosity about human behavior has a way of growing stronger when a pattern refuses to fit the models people normally rely on. In environments where influence strategy and decision-making shape outcomes on a massive scale, people who hold power rarely leave important questions unanswered. When someone displays a psychological pattern that appears resistant to manipulation pressure or social noise, that pattern naturally becomes an object of deeper study. And so the decision was made to involve someone whose profession is built around understanding the architecture of human thought itself. The psychologist who was brought into the situation was not simply tasked with examining rumors or determining whether the accusations surrounding you were true or false. That question had already begun losing relevance as contradictions within those stories became increasingly visible. Instead, the focus of the investigation shifted towards something far more intriguing. The observer wanted to understand the psychology behind your response. They wanted to know why someone placed in a socially tense situation, surrounded by conflicting narratives and pressure to defend themselves, would respond with calm consistency instead of emotional urgency. At first, the psychologist approached the situation with the same analytical framework used in many behavioral studies. Human reactions to stress typically follow recognizable patterns. When a reputation is threatened, people often move into defensive communication. When social tension rises, individuals usually attempt to reassert control over the narrative about them. When rumors circulate, the instinct to correct them becomes strong. These behavioral responses appear so frequently that they form the basis of many psychological models describing how humans protect their identity within groups. Yet the moment the psychologist began reviewing the information about your behavior, something unusual became clear. Your actions did not fit neatly into those models. Instead of attempting to dominate the narrative, you had allowed the narrative to evolve without constant interference. Instead of confronting every accusation directly, you focused your energy on continuing your path. From a purely behavioral perspective, this pattern appeared counterintuitive. Many individuals believe that silence or restraint in the face of rumor signals weakness. But what the psychologist noticed was not weakness. It was something far more complex. Your restraint was not passive. It was deliberate. And deliberate restraint requires a level of internal clarity that most people only develop after long periods of reflection and experience. The investigation began expanding beyond the immediate situation to explore the deeper patterns that might explain your mindset. The psychologist started gathering observations from people who had interacted with you across different stages of your life. They asked about how you handled conflict in the past. They asked about moments when you faced pressure long before these recent rumors appeared. They wanted to see whether your calm response was an isolated event or part of a consistent psychological pattern. The answers they received began painting a picture that surprised even the investigator. Across different environments and time periods, people described similar qualities in your behavior. They spoke about your tendency to observe situations carefully before reacting. They mentioned your habit of asking deeper questions rather than immediately accepting surface explanations. They noted that when you faced criticism or misunderstanding in the past, you rarely responded impulsively. Instead, you seemed to step back, evaluate the situation from multiple perspectives, and then choose a response that aligned with long-term clarity rather than short-term emotion. From a psychological standpoint, this pattern indicated something significant. Many individuals rely heavily on external feedback to determine how they should feel about themselves. When criticism appears, they experience it as a threat to their identity. When rumors spread, their sense of stability becomes tied to how quickly they can correct those narratives. But your psychological structure appeared to operate differently. The psychologist began recognizing that your sense of identity did not depend heavily on immediate social approval. Instead, it seemed anchored in a deeper internal framework built from reflection, experience, and personal values. This type of internal anchoring changes how a person responds to external turbulence. When someone's self-perception is stable, rumors lose much of their psychological leverage. They may still create social noise, but they do not disrupt the person's internal clarity about who they are and what they stand for. The psychologist started documenting this pattern carefully because it revealed an important principle about human resilience. Individuals who cultivate a stable internal identity often display extraordinary composure during periods of social pressure. They do not ignore criticism or misunderstanding, but they refuse to let those external signals define their internal reality. As the investigation progressed, another insight emerged that caught the attention of both the psychologist and the observer who initiated the study. Your behavior demonstrated something that psychological research often describes, but rarely observes so clearly in real life: the ability to separate reputation from identity. Reputation exists in the minds of others and changes depending on who is telling the story. Identity, on the other hand, exists within the individual and reflects the principles guiding their actions. Most people experience intense anxiety when their reputation is challenged because they unconsciously merge those two concepts. They begin believing that if others misunderstand them, their identity itself is under attack. But the psychologist noticed that you seem to treat those two dimensions very differently. When rumors about your reputation began circulating, you did not immediately treat them as threats to your core identity. Instead, you allowed the situation to unfold while continuing to act in alignment with the values that define you. From a psychological perspective, this distinction represents a powerful form of mental independence. It means that while others may temporarily influence how you are perceived, they cannot easily alter how you understand yourself. This realization shifted the direction of the investigation once again. What began as an attempt to analyze a strange social situation gradually transformed into a deeper exploration of psychological strength. The observer who had originally hired the psychologist began seeing the situation from a completely new angle. Instead of viewing you as someone caught in the middle of a rumor-driven conflict, they began viewing you as an example of something far more valuable, a person whose mindset remained stable even when the environment around them became unstable. And stability of mind is one of the rarest qualities in any environment where power, influence, and human ambition constantly collide. The psychologist eventually presented their observations in a report that surprised the observer even further. According to the analysis, your calm behavior was not simply a reaction to this particular situation. It appeared to be the natural outcome of a mindset built through long-term self-awareness. You had developed the ability to recognize when external noise deserved attention and when it did not. You had learned how to maintain perspective when others attempted to draw you into emotional conflict. Most importantly, you demonstrated the capacity to let time reveal truth rather than attempting to force truth into visibility through constant argument. The report concluded with a statement that captured the essence of what the investigation had discovered. The real mystery was not why rumors had formed around you. Rumors form around many people. The real mystery was how someone could remain so psychologically centered while those rumors unfolded. And the answer, according to the psychologist, was both simple and profound. You had cultivated a level of internal clarity that made external chaos far less powerful than it might otherwise have been. In that moment, the observer realized that the investigation had revealed something far more valuable than they initially expected. What they thought would be a study of rumors had become a lesson in resilience. And the person at the center of that lesson was you. Why your mindset cannot be manipulated easily begins revealing itself once the psychological investigation described earlier reaches its most important conclusion, because when the psychologist finished examining your behavioral patterns, they realized that the real reason the situation surrounding you had become so unusual was not the rumors themselves, but the mental architecture that guided the way you responded to them. Human manipulation almost always relies on predictable emotional triggers. Whether the manipulation comes through criticism, praise, fear, guilt, or social pressure, the underlying strategy is usually the same. Someone introduces a stimulus designed to provoke a reaction, and once that reaction appears, they begin steering the situation using the emotional momentum created by it. This pattern has existed throughout human history because it works effectively on people whose identity and emotional balance depend heavily on external validation. When individuals feel compelled to defend themselves quickly, prove their worth constantly, or control how others perceive them at every moment, manipulators gain access to powerful levers that can influence behavior. The moment someone becomes desperate to correct every misunderstanding or silence every critic, they unknowingly give power to the very voices they are trying to overcome. Yet, when the psychologist examined your behavior through this lens, they discovered something that made your response so difficult to predict. The usual emotional triggers that manipulation depends upon did not appear to activate the same reactions in you. This did not mean you were unaware of what was happening around you. On the contrary, your awareness seemed unusually sharp. You recognized the presence of rumors, contradictions, and shifting narratives just as clearly as anyone else observing the situation. But instead of allowing those stimuli to dictate your behavior, you evaluated them through a deeper internal framework before deciding how to respond. This ability alone changes the entire dynamic of influence. When someone pauses to examine emotional triggers rather than reacting immediately to them, manipulation loses its most important tool: speed. Manipulation thrives on urgency. It works best when people feel pressured to react quickly before they have time to analyze the situation calmly. But your pattern of reflection interrupted that process repeatedly. Every time someone attempted to provoke a reaction through rumor, accusation, or social pressure, they encountered the same unexpected response: patience. And patience is one of the most powerful forms of psychological independence a person can develop. Because patience creates space for clarity. Instead of reacting to the first interpretation that appears in a tense situation, patient individuals allow time for multiple perspectives to emerge. They examine the motivations behind certain statements. They observe how narratives evolve when new information appears. They pay attention to patterns rather than isolated moments. This broader perspective allows them to distinguish between genuine criticism and strategic manipulation more easily than someone reacting emotionally in the heat of the moment. The psychologist recognized that this was precisely what had been happening in your situation from the very beginning. While others expected you to defend yourself impulsively or confront the rumors directly, you quietly allowed the situation to unfold long enough for its deeper patterns to become visible. In doing so, you removed the emotional leverage that manipulators often rely upon. Instead of giving them a dramatic reaction that could fuel further speculation, you gave them something far less useful: stillness. At first, those attempting to provoke you may have interpreted your calmness as uncertainty. In environments where emotional intensity often dominates communication, people sometimes assume that silence indicates confusion or weakness. Yet as time passed, it became clear that your restraint had nothing to do with uncertainty. It reflected confidence in a different form of influence entirely. Rather than controlling the narrative through confrontation, you allowed the inconsistencies within the narrative to expose themselves naturally. The longer the rumors circulated without the emotional reaction they expected from you, the more visible their contradictions became. This process illustrates a deeper psychological principle that the investigation eventually highlighted in its final observations. Manipulation becomes ineffective when the target of manipulation understands their own values clearly enough to resist external emotional pressure. Individuals who know what they stand for internally do not feel compelled to adjust their behavior every time someone questions their reputation externally. They may listen, reflect, and even learn from criticism when it carries genuine insight, but they do not surrender their emotional stability simply because someone attempts to provoke them. The psychologist described this pattern as a form of mental sovereignty. Just as nations protect their borders to maintain independence, individuals with strong psychological awareness protect the boundaries of their attention and emotional energy. They recognize that not every voice deserves immediate response. They understand that reacting to every accusation or rumor can actually amplify the very narratives they wish to dissolve. Instead of engaging in endless cycles of defense, they remain anchored in the principles guiding their actions. Over time, this stability begins influencing the environment around them in subtle ways. People observing such composure often start reassessing their assumptions. They notice that the person being accused does not display the insecurity or hostility typically associated with guilt or deception. They see someone who continues moving forward with clarity, while others remain trapped in emotional argument. This contrast naturally draws attention to the motivations behind the accusations themselves. The more stable your mindset appeared, the more unstable the accusations began to look by comparison. What the psychologist eventually realized was that your behavior demonstrated something individuals strive to develop, but rarely achieve completely: the ability to separate reaction from identity. You did not define yourself by how quickly you responded to criticism. You defined yourself by how consistently you lived according to your values, regardless of that criticism. This distinction may sound simple, but its psychological implications are profound. When a person's identity is grounded in principles rather than reputation, manipulation loses much of its power. Critics can question their image, but they cannot easily destabilize their internal clarity. The observer who had originally commissioned the investigation found this conclusion especially fascinating. In environments where strategic thinking often determines success or failure, encountering someone whose mindset cannot be easily manipulated represents a rare advantage. Most people, even highly intelligent individuals, still carry emotional triggers that can be exploited under the right circumstances. Fear of rejection, desire for recognition, need for validation, or resentment toward criticism can all become entry points for influence. But the psychologist's report suggested that your mental discipline had gradually minimized the impact of those triggers. You did not depend heavily on external praise to confirm your worth, and therefore praise could not easily control your decisions. You did not fear criticism enough to compromise your integrity, and therefore criticism could not easily intimidate you. You did not rush to prove yourself when misunderstood, and therefore misunderstanding could not easily provoke you into strategic mistakes. Each of these traits formed part of a psychological shield that made manipulation increasingly difficult. This realization transformed the observer's perspective once again. The rumors that initially attracted their curiosity now seemed almost irrelevant compared to the deeper lesson revealed by your behavior. What they had witnessed was not merely someone surviving social conflict. They had witnessed someone demonstrating a level of mental independence that many people spend their entire lives trying to cultivate. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this discovery was that you did not appear to be performing this mindset deliberately to impress anyone. Your composure did not resemble a carefully staged performance designed to project strength. It appeared natural, as though it had been shaped gradually through years of reflection, challenge, and personal growth. That authenticity made the lesson even more powerful, because authentic psychological strength does not emerge overnight. It develops through countless moments when individuals choose clarity over impulse, patience over reaction, and truth over temporary approval. By the time the investigation reached its conclusion, one thing had become unmistakably clear. The people who initially believed they could manipulate the narrative about you were not simply facing someone who refused to react emotionally. They were facing someone whose mindset had evolved beyond the mechanisms that manipulation depends upon. And when manipulation loses its influence, the truth about a person eventually reveals itself with remarkable clarity. The moment when the narrative completely reversed began unfolding quietly once the psychological investigation and the growing observations around your behavior reached a tipping point, because there comes a stage in every social narrative when the direction of attention suddenly shifts and what once seemed certain begins to appear questionable. For a long time, the energy surrounding your name had been shaped by rumors, assumptions, and stories, repeated with confidence by individuals who believed the community would accept their version of events without deeper examination. At the beginning of the situation, that expectation seemed reasonable. Human communities often rely on the loudest voices to construct their initial understanding of events. When someone tells a story with conviction and emotional intensity, listeners frequently accept it because emotional certainty creates the illusion of truth. Yet as the weeks and months passed, the pattern surrounding those accusations began revealing something unexpected. The louder certain individuals became in defending their version of events, the more observers started noticing the inconsistencies embedded within their narratives. Earlier, those inconsistencies might have remained invisible because attention was focused primarily on the claims themselves. But by this stage, the environment had changed. The psychological investigation had already highlighted the unusual calmness of your response. People had observed your continued stability despite the rumors circulating around you. And gradually, the attention of the community began drifting away from the accusations toward the people making them. This shift may appear subtle at first, but socially it represents a powerful turning point. When a narrative begins collapsing under its own contradictions, the focus naturally moves from the target of the accusations to the credibility of the accusers. Instead of asking whether the person being discussed deserves criticism, observers begin asking why the critics themselves appear so determined to maintain a story that keeps changing. In your situation, this transition occurred slowly, but unmistakably. Conversations that once repeated the rumors without hesitation began including questions. Someone would mention a detail from one version of the story that did not match another version told earlier. Another person would recall an interaction with you that contradicted the negative image being described. A third observer might notice how consistently you continued living according to your values, despite the noise surrounding your reputation. These small observations started weaving together into a broader realization, spreading quietly through the community. The realization was simple yet profound. The person at the center of the rumors did not appear to behave like someone hiding something. Instead, the individuals repeating those rumors appeared increasingly anxious to defend their narrative whenever it was questioned. From a psychological perspective, this reversal is one of the most revealing moments in any social conflict. When a narrative is grounded in truth, it typically remains stable under examination. Details remain consistent because they originate from genuine events. But when a narrative is constructed strategically to damage someone's reputation, it often requires constant adjustment to survive new questions. Each time someone notices a contradiction, the story must be modified slightly to preserve its overall structure. Over time, those modifications accumulate, creating a patchwork of explanations that no longer align perfectly with one another. Observers may not immediately identify every inconsistency, but they begin sensing that something about the situation does not feel entirely coherent. That sense of unease gradually spreads as more people compare notes with one another. In the earlier stages of the situation, those conversations might have remained private because individuals assumed they were the only ones noticing irregularities. But once enough people begin recognizing the same patterns, those observations become harder to ignore. The community slowly transitions from passive acceptance to active reflection. People who once repeated the rumors without hesitation begin speaking more cautiously. Instead of asserting accusations as fact, they start framing them as questions. And questions have a remarkable ability to reshape narratives. Once a narrative must defend itself repeatedly, its weaknesses become easier to see. During this phase, your continued composure played an even more important role than before. Because while the stories surrounding you were beginning to unravel, you did not attempt to accelerate that process through confrontation or public vindication. You maintained the same steady focus that had defined your behavior from the beginning. This restraint reinforced the contrast between your stability and the growing instability of the accusations. Observers watching the situation unfold began recognizing that the person who appeared most at peace with the unfolding events was the one who had been criticized the most. Meanwhile, the individuals responsible for spreading the rumors appeared increasingly defensive when their narratives were examined more closely. This contrast created a psychological mirror within the community. People started reflecting not only on the situation itself, but also on their own reactions to it. Some realized that they had accepted certain claims too quickly, simply because they trusted the confidence of the person presenting them. Others recognized that their initial judgments had been influenced by social pressure, rather than careful evaluation. These realizations were not always comfortable, but they represented an important stage in the restoration of clarity. Because when individuals begin acknowledging how easily narratives can shape perception, they become more cautious about repeating claims without evidence. This shift in awareness gradually strengthened the reversal already taking place. The same voices that once amplified the rumors about you began falling silent as the community's attention turned toward examining the contradictions behind those rumors. And silence in such situations often speaks louder than accusation. When people stop repeating a narrative that once circulated widely, it signals that confidence in that narrative has weakened. Meanwhile, new conversations began emerging that highlighted the qualities observers had witnessed directly in your behavior. People spoke about the patience you demonstrated during the conflict. They mentioned the consistency of your actions despite external pressure. They described how your response had challenged the assumption that emotional reaction is the only way to defend oneself against criticism. These discussions gradually replaced the earlier rumors as the dominant narrative surrounding your name. What makes this stage especially significant is that it did not occur because you demanded recognition or forced the community to change its perspective. The reversal happened organically as individuals reached their own conclusions through observation and reflection. In many ways, this type of transformation carries greater credibility than any direct defense could achieve. When people discover inconsistencies themselves rather than being told about them, the realization becomes deeply convincing. By the time the reversal was fully visible, something remarkable had occurred. The situation that once threatened to damage your reputation had instead revealed the strength of your character to a much wider audience. People who might never have paid close attention to your mindset before were now discussing the unusual composure you displayed during one of the most challenging social circumstances a person can face. Even the observer who initially commissioned the psychological investigation began recognizing that the most important lesson of the entire situation had nothing to do with the rumors themselves. The true revelation was how a single individual's discipline and patience could reshape an entire narrative without engaging in the usual cycles of confrontation and defense. This realization carried a powerful message, not only for those observing you, but also for anyone reflecting on their own response to criticism and misunderstanding. Because the moment when a narrative reverses often arrives not through force but through endurance. It emerges when someone remains aligned with their principles long enough for truth to reveal itself through time and consistency. And as the community around you gradually acknowledged this transformation, it became clear that the reversal of the narrative was not simply about correcting a misunderstanding. It was about recognizing the quiet power of a mind that refuses to be defined by the noise surrounding it. The deeper reason. Your presence makes certain people uncomfortable gradually reveals itself once the entire sequence of events surrounding you is examined from a wider perspective, because by the time the narrative had already begun reversing, and the community started recognizing the inconsistencies in the accusations made about you, a deeper psychological truth was quietly surfacing beneath the surface of those events. At first, many observers assumed that the hostility directed toward you originated purely from misunderstanding or momentary conflict. In many social environments, disagreements escalate simply because people interpret situations differently or react emotionally in the heat of the moment. Yet as the dust settled and individuals began reflecting on the entire timeline of what had occurred, it became increasingly clear that the reaction you received from certain individuals could not be explained by misunderstanding alone. The intensity of their efforts to control the narrative about you suggested something deeper was influencing their behavior. And that deeper factor had very little to do with the rumors themselves. Instead, it had everything to do with what your presence represented psychologically. Throughout the entire situation, you demonstrated a pattern that many people encounter very rarely in their lives: the presence of someone whose identity is not easily shaped by external pressure. In environments where social dynamics depend heavily on influence, persuasion, and subtle forms of control, individuals often become accustomed to navigating relationships through emotional leverage. They learn which words can provoke guilt, which criticisms can trigger insecurity, and which compliments can encourage compliance. These strategies do not always appear malicious on the surface because they are woven into everyday communication. Yet they form a hidden framework through which many people unconsciously manage social power. When someone enters such an environment who does not respond predictably to those emotional signals, the entire framework becomes unstable. This is precisely what happened in your case. People who initially attempted to define your reputation through rumor or criticism expected that those tactics would provoke the usual reactions. They expected you to defend yourself urgently, to argue with them publicly, or to become emotionally entangled in the conflict they were creating. Any of those reactions would have allowed them to maintain a certain degree of control over the narrative. But when your response remained calm, reflective, and steady, something unusual occurred. The mechanisms that normally influence people's behavior simply stopped working. And when those mechanisms fail, individuals who rely on them often experience a sense of psychological discomfort they struggle to explain. This discomfort does not always manifest as quiet reflection. More often, it appears as intensified criticism or increased attempts to provoke a reaction. When someone cannot influence another person through the methods they are accustomed to using, they may escalate their efforts in an attempt to regain that lost leverage. This escalation explains why the rumors about you initially grew louder instead of fading quickly. Those who felt unsettled by your independence unconsciously tried to restore control by amplifying the narrative they had created. Yet each attempt to provoke you produced the same unexpected outcome: composure. And composure in the face of pressure has a powerful psychological effect. It acts like a mirror, reflecting the emotional state of those who attempt to disturb it. The calmer you remained, the more visible the agitation of your critics became by comparison. Over time, this contrast began revealing something that many observers had not initially recognized. The discomfort certain individuals felt around you was not caused by anything you had done to them directly. It was caused by the example your behavior represented. Your presence challenged an unspoken assumption within the social environment. That assumption suggested that influence belongs to the loudest voices or the most emotionally persuasive narratives. Yet your response demonstrated that influence can also emerge from patience, clarity, and consistency. For individuals accustomed to maintaining social control through emotional pressure, encountering someone who cannot be easily manipulated can feel deeply unsettling. It forces them to confront the possibility that their usual strategies are not universally effective. Psychologists often describe this experience as cognitive dissonance, the tension people feel when reality contradicts the assumptions guiding their behavior. In your case, the dissonance appeared when critics expected emotional reaction, but received calm reflection instead. Each time their expectations were contradicted, The gap between their narrative and reality grew wider. Eventually, that gap became visible not only to them, but to everyone observing the situation. By this stage, the community had already begun recognizing that the accusations surrounding you lacked consistency. But the deeper realization now emerging was even more significant. People were starting to understand why those accusations had been created with such intensity in the first place. It was not simply about damaging your reputation. It was about neutralizing the discomfort your independence created. When someone embodies a level of internal clarity that cannot be easily influenced by social pressure, they unintentionally disrupt the psychological balance of environments where influence depends on emotional control. Yet what makes this dynamic particularly interesting is that your presence also produced a completely different reaction among another group of observers. While some individuals felt threatened by your independence, others felt inspired by it. They saw in your behavior a demonstration of what it looks like to remain anchored in one's values even when circumstances become turbulent. Many people spend years searching for examples of emotional resilience that are not merely theoretical, but lived in real situations. Watching someone maintain dignity during misunderstanding provides exactly that kind of example. For those observers, the lesson of your experience extended far beyond the specific rumors that once surrounded your name. It revealed the quiet strength that emerges when individuals cultivate self-awareness deeply enough that external noise no longer dictates their direction. The longer people reflected on your response to the conflict, the more they began recognizing how rare such steadiness truly is. Modern environments often reward immediate reaction. Social conversations move quickly, opinions spread instantly, and individuals feel pressure to defend themselves publicly whenever criticism appears. In such conditions, patience can appear almost countercultural. Yet your behavior demonstrated that patience does not weaken influence. It refines it. By refusing to react impulsively, you allowed the truth of the situation to emerge naturally through time and observation. And in doing so, you revealed something that many people had never considered before. Strength does not always appear through confrontation. Sometimes it appears through restraint. The deeper reason your presence unsettled certain individuals, therefore, had little to do with the rumors they attempted to spread. It had everything to do with the contrast your mindset created. You represented a form of psychological freedom that many environments quietly discourage. Because when people become emotionally independent, they cannot be easily steered through fear, approval, or social pressure. Their decisions arise from clarity rather than reaction. And clarity has a way of exposing illusions that might otherwise remain unchallenged. By the time observers fully understood this dynamic, the entire meaning of the situation had transformed. What once appeared to be a conflict about reputation had revealed itself as a lesson about mindset. The rumors that once seemed powerful lost their significance compared to the deeper insight emerging from your response. The real story was not about accusations or contradictions. The real story was about the rare stability of a person who refused to surrender their inner direction simply because external voices attempted to define it. And as more people reflected on that realization, they began understanding something important about their own lives as well. Because every individual eventually encounters moments when misunderstanding or criticism tests their sense of identity. In those moments, the temptation to react impulsively becomes strong. Yet your experience demonstrated another possibility. It showed that when someone remains grounded in their values and patient enough to allow truth to unfold through time, even the loudest narratives can eventually dissolve. And the quiet clarity that remains afterward speaks more powerfully than any argument ever could. The quiet victory that no one expected gradually becomes visible when you step back and observe everything that unfolded from the beginning of this situation to the present moment, because what initially appeared to be a chaotic storm of rumors, accusations, and conflicting stories ultimately revealed something far more meaningful than the conflict itself. At the start, many voices tried to define your identity through narratives that were repeated with certainty. And for a time, those narratives seemed powerful simply because they were loud and persistent. Yet as the events continued unfolding, the deeper truth slowly began rising to the surface through a process that no one could force or manipulate. Instead of engaging in endless arguments or trying to silence every accusation, you chose a different path, one rooted in patience, observation, and unwavering alignment with your values. That decision quietly transformed the entire dynamic surrounding you. While others exhausted themselves trying to maintain stories that required constant revision, your consistency became the most powerful testimony of all. People watching the situation gradually recognized that truth does not always need to shout in order to be heard. Sometimes it only needs time and clarity to reveal itself. And as the contradictions in the rumors became increasingly visible, the narrative that once surrounded your name began dissolving naturally, leaving behind a much clearer understanding of who you truly are. What makes this outcome especially powerful is that it did not rely on domination, retaliation, or public confrontation. Instead, it emerged from a deeper strength, the strength of a mind that cannot be easily manipulated, and a character that remains stable even when circumstances become turbulent. In the end, the real victory was never about proving others wrong. It was about demonstrating that when a person remains anchored in truth and refuses to let external noise dictate their identity, the very forces that once attempted to diminish them eventually expose their own weakness. And perhaps the most inspiring part of this entire journey is the realization that such strength is not reserved for a select few, but can be cultivated by anyone willing to develop the same clarity, patience, and inner discipline that allowed you to turn a storm of accusations into a powerful testament of resilience.